Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and we continue on with the biography of Patrick Cleburne and see how he dealt with the secession winter and the opening stages of the Civil War. In April 1860, Cleburne, although not very politically active, would still serve as a delegate to the State Democratic Convention in Little Rock, Arkansas. His friend Thomas Heineman would sponsor a resolution requiring Arkansas delegates to leave the National Convention in protest unless the party adopted a platform plank for a national slave code. When the Democratic Party met in Charleston, South Carolina for their National Convention, Northern Democrats refused any such plank, and many of the Southern Democrats walked out, including half of the Arkansas delegates. Southern Democrats met in Richmond, Virginia, and chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky as their candidate, and Northern Democrats met in Baltimore, Maryland, and chose Stephen Douglas as their candidate. The Republicans would choose Abraham Lincoln, and a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. On Election Day 1860, Cleburne cast his ballot for Breckinridge, but Abraham Lincoln would be elected president. Heineman would urge for secession of the southern states, but Cleburne was obviously torn. During the secession winter, Cleburne wrote to his brother Robert, living in Newport, Kentucky, that, "I never spent a more gloomy Christmas. My partners were participating in gaieties I did not feel like sharing. I have been invited to 20 parties this Christmas and have not attended one. I hardly know what to say to you about politics. The fever of revolution is very contagious. My own opinion is that the first bloodshed on Southern soil and a collision between federal troops and the state authorities of any Southern state will be the signal for civil war." Cleburne hoped that the Union could be preserved, but only if the federal government proved willing to grant the South what he called the full measure of her constitutional rights. If that could not be met, he stated that he hoped to see all the Southern states united in a new confederation, that we can effect a peaceable separation. He considered himself a son of Arkansas and stated to his brother that these people have been my friends and have stood up for me on all occasions. He concluded that I am with Arkansas in weal or woe. He and his brothers were products of their location. William in Wisconsin and Joseph in Indiana were for Lincoln. Robert in Kentucky just hoped his state could survive a precarious neutrality, and Patrick was a states' rights Democrat. Each one reflected the society in which they lived. The summer of 1860 saw Cleburne help form the Yell Rifles, named after former Governor Archibald Yell, who had been killed at the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican War. 115 volunteers joined the group, and they elected Cleburne their captain, presumably because of his 3.5 years in the British Army. Since Cleburne had been in the United States, he had saw the disadvantages that Irish immigrants had in the country. He attempted to rid himself of his Irish accent. However, during his time drilling his volunteers in the Yell Rifles, his Irish roots were exposed. As he bellowed forth commands, he would let words slip into an Irish brogue, and his troops took notice of it. Although shy and bashful around women, and initially shy in any public forum, Cleburne had developed into a good public speaker when addressing his men at lodge meetings, political rallies, and on the drill field. In early 1861, a rumor spread throughout the state that federal troops were on their way to support a federal arsenal in Little Rock. This caused many civic leaders to reach out to the governor and offer their militias to the cause. Through a series of miscommunications, the civic leaders believed the governor to be asking for support when he actually wasn't, and began sending their militia companies. Cleburne's Yell Rifles steamed down the Mississippi, then up the Arkansas River to Little Rock, where they arrived on February 5th. Soon, nearly 1,000 militiamen of various disciplines descended upon Little Rock, causing great concern to its citizens. The governor, a little concerned, but also seeing an opportunity, sent a message to the commander of the arsenal informing him that he could not control the growing numbers of troops in the city, and urged him to turn over the arsenal to state authorities. On February 8th, he did just that, and the militias returned to their locales. As Arkansas seceded and mobilized for war following the firing on Fort Sumter and Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, they sought to arm their militias and ordered rifles and ammunition from northern dealers. One of the ships carrying Helena's order was stopped and detained by city officials in Cincinnati, Ohio. Irate, Helena's officials ordered the first Cincinnati-owned ship that passed by on the Mississippi River to be captured. The ship, the Queen of the West, a Cincinnati-owned vessel, had a cannonball shot across its bow, and it halted, and Helena captured it. However, the owner of the ship was Thomas Sherlock, the brother of the man who married Cleburne's sister. Patrick made a passionate speech to the city leaders, where he wept and asked them to release the ship. They relented, and the ship went on its way. A few days later, Claiborne and the Yale Rifles left their homes in Helena to join the war. They steamed up the Mississippi to an open plain a few miles north of Memphis on the west bank of the river, designated Camp Rector after the governor of Arkansas. There, the companies were formed into regiments, and those regiments elected their colonel. The Yale Rifles were placed in the 1st Arkansas Volunteer Infantry, and they elected Claiborne their colonel without opposition on May 8, 1861. Although the regiment chose their own officers, generals in the state armed forces would be chosen by a 3-man military board chaired by the governor. They created 3 generals, 1 major general and 2 brigadier generals. The brigadier general who took command of the forces at Camp Rector was Thomas H. Bradley, a 65-year-old Southern planter and a Union man until the last moment, who had no military experience. When Bradley arrived at Camp Rector, he was met with derision from many of the troops who did not fancy the idea of serving under him. Claiborne reported to Bradley, and barely a week as commander went by before he ordered a reconnaissance in force toward Bearsville Point, where unverified rumors of Yankees were said to be. He ordered Claiborne's 1st Arkansas to lead the advance. Bradley hadn't ordered enough supplies, the route seemed random, and when the troops found nothing, he failed to recall an advance scouting party and essentially abandoned them. And the quick recall of Claiborne's force forced them to abandon supplies that were carried to that point. Once the Arkansas troops returned to Camp Rector, the men from Arkansas urged Claiborne to do something, and Claiborne viewed Bradley as a threat to the safety of his men. Patrick would post a guard at Bradley's headquarters, basically putting him under arrest. He sent word to his friend Judge Hanley that Arkansas forces returned from Bearsfield Point between 2 suns, a quantity of material abandoned, scouting party picked of men abandoned, no enemy nearer than Cairo, we are the laughingstock of the Tennesseans. He hoped his friend would take his actions to the military board and represent them accurately. What Claiborne had done was a mutiny. He allowed Bradley to leave Camp Rector, and the displaced commander went straight to Little Rock and wanted Claiborne and 5 others brought up on the charge of mutiny. The court-martial failed to take place. For one reason, Bradley was afraid that an inquiry would expose his incompetence and he would resign his commission in humiliation. Although it turned out to be okay for the Irishman, it was a close call to fight back against a superior like he had. Soon, the provisional president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, ordered General William J. Hardee to take over command of all troops north of the Arkansas River and west of the White and Black Rivers. This would begin a strong friendship between Hardee and Claiborne. Patrick admired Hardee's military decorum and confidence, and Hardee appreciated Claiborne's attentiveness to his troops. They became very close friends. Another reason that Hardee liked Claiborne was because he had the best drilled soldiers under his command. Claiborne ran a strict drill, and he was present and commanded all of the drills himself. His men hated the constant manual of arms instructions, but respected Claiborne for being with them through it all. Claiborne also had a unique punishment for minor infractions. He had the man carry a rail for a mile. Every soldier knew what was about to transpire when the wooden rail was called for and given to a poor man. By August, Hardee and Claiborne had moved their troops in southeastern Missouri in coordination with Gideon Pillow's push towards St. Louis. The campaign ground to a halt when Pillow became cautious to the point of inaction. In the second week of August, it looked like Claiborne was going to get his first taste of battle. Union troops were supposedly on the road toward the Irishman's position. He had the 1st Arkansas and a single cannon. When he ordered the artillery forward, he found that the crew had went into the house of a woman whose husband was serving in the Confederate Army and plundered her house. A rider approached Claiborne and informed him that the enemy was approaching. The captain of the gun asked that his men be released so they could man the gun, but Claiborne said in a loud, clear voice that his men expected to fill honorable graves and not to rest side by side with thieves. It was a moment that many troops who heard it would remember because it had a moral effect on the troops. Despite his preparedness, the blue troops never made their appearance. The town hall was used as Hardee's and Claiborne's headquarters. It was also used as a prison for a handful of Federal soldiers. The lieutenant who had brought in the prisoners was also tasked with guarding them. In the night, Claiborne was awakened by the yells that the prisoners were escaping. He grabbed his pistol and stepped out of his room to see a figure running down the hallway. He leveled his pistol and fired. When he went over to the man, he found that it was the lieutenant. The young man had dreamed that the prisoners were escaping, and had half asleep ran down the hallway shouting. Cleburne asked the man to forgive him. Lieutenant granted it, but would die. The first man Cleburne killed during the war was a fellow officer. Hardee and Cleburne left Missouri and traveled to Bowling Green, Kentucky, where Confederate Commander Albert Sidney Johnston was located, part of a defensive line that ran from Columbus, Kentucky to Bowling Green and then to Cumberland Gap. At Bowling Green, Cleburne became a brigade commander. He commanded the 1st and 5th Arkansas, the 6th Mississippi, and the 5th Tennessee. While at Bowling Green, word reached Hardee and Johnston that Federal troops were occupying Jamestown, Kentucky. They sent Cleburne and his brigade to investigate, but all he found was a few cavalry that he drove off easily. He noticed that every town he passed through was nearly abandoned, scared of the Confederate army, so he decided to attempt to convince the citizens of that part of Kentucky that they had nothing to fear. If they found belongings or luggage from citizens trying to hide their valuables, or had left their baggage in a hasty retreat out of the area, Cleburne ordered it to be returned to the nearest house with a note saying, "Returned by Southern soldiers." The brigade returned to Bowling Green, having found no major Federal troops. It was now November, and the next few months would consist of many setbacks for the Confederacy. In January, a Confederate force would be defeated at Mill Springs, and in February, the two forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, would fall to Union forces, forcing Johnston to pull his troops further south. By March, Cleburne and his men were at Shelbyville, Tennessee. On the 4th of that month, Cleburne would be made a brigadier general. Yet he had not participated in any major battle. However, that soon would change.